Picture this. You're standing in a muddy field in 1415. The smell of horse manure, unwashed bodies, and fear fills the air. Metal clanks around you as thousands of armored men shift nervously. Suddenly, a horn blows. You have exactly 30 seconds before you're either dead, dying, or running for your life. And here's the terrifying truth. Even if you were in the best shape of your life, even if you knew how to fight, even if you had the best armor money could buy, you'd still probably be dead before you could say, Game of Thrones. Today, we're diving deep into the brutal reality of medieval warfare. This isn't Hollywood. This isn't fantasy. This is what really happened when ordinary men were thrown into the meat grinder of medieval battlefields. And trust me, it's far more terrifying than any movie could ever show you. Welcome back to Life in the Dark Ages, where we uncover the brutal truths of medieval life that Hollywood doesn't want you to know. I'm your host, and today we're answering a question that's been haunting historians for centuries. Why did so many people die so quickly in medieval battles? We're going to walk through exactly what would happen to you. Yes, you, if you were transported back to a medieval battlefield. We'll explore the weapons that could kill you in seconds, the tactics that turned men into hamburger meat, and the psychological horror that broke even the bravest warriors. But first, let me ask you something. Have you ever wondered why medieval battles were so incredibly deadly? Why entire armies could be wiped out in a matter of hours? Well, buckle up because we're about to find out. Let's start with a reality check. When you think of medieval warfare, you probably picture knights in shining armor having noble duels, right? Maybe some dramatic sword fights like in Braveheart or The Lord of the Rings. Forget all of that. Throw it out the window. Medieval warfare was industrial-scale slaughter. It was chaos, terror, and death on a scale that would make modern soldiers weep. And here's the kicker. Most of the people fighting weren't professional soldiers. They were farmers, craftsmen, and peasants who'd been handed a weapon and told to charge into hell. Let me paint you a picture of what you'd actually face. The Battle of Agincourt in 1415, one of the most famous medieval battles. The French had around 25,000 men. The English had about 6,000. Sounds like the French should have won easily, right? Wrong. By the end of the day, over 10,000 French soldiers were dead. The English lost less than 30 men, 30.0. That's not a battle. That's a massacre. And it happened in just a few hours. Now imagine you're one of those French soldiers. You're standing in that field wearing 60 pounds of armor, carrying a 15-pound weapon, and you can barely see through your helmet. The ground is muddy from rain and, let's be honest, from the bodily fluids of terrified men. Your first challenge? Just moving. That armor isn't like the movies where knights dance around like ninjas. Real medieval armor was heavy, restrictive, and exhausting. Studies show that a fully armored knight could only fight effectively for about 15 minutes before exhaustion set in. But here's where it gets worse. You're not just fighting one person. You're in a massive crowd of thousands of men, all trying to kill each other in a space smaller than a football field. You can't see what's coming from your left, your right, or behind you. And remember, once you have about 30 seconds before something tries to kill you. Now let's talk about the weapons that could end your life in the blink of an eye. And spoiler alert, swords are probably the least of your worries. First up, the longbow. This isn't Robin Hood's cute little archery set. A medieval longbow could fire an arrow at 180 feet per second, with enough force to punch through armor from 200 yards away. English longbowmen could fire 12 arrows per minute. That's one arrow every 5 seconds. At Agincourt, the English had about 5,000 longbowmen. Do the math. That's 60,000 arrows per minute raining down on the French. Imagine standing in a hailstorm where every hailstone is a steel-tipped death dart designed to punch through your skull. But arrows are just the beginning. Let's talk about the crossbow. While longbows required years of training, any peasant could learn to use a crossbow in a few days. And medieval crossbows were terrifyingly effective. They could punch through chainmail like it was paper and had enough force to pin a man to a tree. The Vatican actually tried to ban crossbows in 1139 because they were too deadly for Christian warfare. Think about that. The Catholic Church said these weapons were too horrible for war. But of course, nobody listened. Now let's get to the really nasty stuff, polearms. These are the weapons that actually did most of the killing in medieval battles. We're talking about halberds, pikes, glaives, and other long, sharp, horrible things designed to kill you from a distance. A halberd is basically an axe, a spear, and a hook all welded together on an 8-foot pole. It can chop, stab, and pull you off your horse all at the same time. And here's the terrifying part. You don't need to be skilled to use one effectively, just point and thrust. But the real nightmare weapon? The pike. Picture a 20-foot-long spear held by a disciplined formation of soldiers. When these guys got into formation, they created a wall of steel points that nothing could break through. Cavalry charges, the tanks of medieval warfare, were absolutely useless against a proper pike square. Swiss pikemen were so effective that they dominated European battlefields for over 200 years. They could take down armored knights, break cavalry charges, and turn infantry into mincemeat. And they did it all with a simple wooden pole with a steel point. Oh, and let's not forget about siege weapons. Catapults, trebuchets, and early cannons didn't just attack castles. They were used in field battles too. Getting hit by a 90-pound stone traveling at 150 miles per hour doesn't care how good your armor is. You're not getting back up from that. The crossbow bolt to the chest, the halberd to the neck, the pike through the ribs. These weapons were designed for one purpose: to kill you as quickly and efficiently as possible. And they were very, very good at their job. But here's what movies never show you: the psychological horror of medieval warfare. The weapons might kill your body, but the fear could destroy your mind before you even drew your sword. Imagine you're a 20-year-old peasant. You've never been more than 10 miles from your village. You've never seen violence worse than a tavern brawl. And suddenly you're standing in a field with 20,000 other terrified men about to face an army that wants to kill you. The noise alone would break most modern people. We're talking about thousands of men screaming, horses neighing, metal clanging, and the constant thunder of hoofbeats. Medieval battles were loud, louder than a rock concert, louder than a jet engine, and that noise meant death was coming. Then there's the smell. Medieval armies didn't have showers, toilets, or deodorant. Add in the smell of fear, blood, and death, and you've got a sensory nightmare that would make you vomit before you even started fighting. But the real psychological killer was what historians call battle shock, what we now know as PTSD. Medieval chroniclers wrote about soldiers who would suddenly freeze up, start crying, or just run away screaming. They called it cowardice. We now know it was a normal human response to extraordinary trauma. Here's the account from a medieval chronicler about the Battle of Crécy in 1346. Men were so afraid that they wet themselves and could not hold their weapons steady. Some fell to their knees and prayed. Others simply ran, throwing down their arms and fleeing like rabbits. And this was before the fighting even started. The truth is, most medieval soldiers weren't brave warriors. They were terrified human beings forced into an impossible situation. The ones who survived weren't necessarily the strongest or most skilled. They were the ones who could function while absolutely terrified. But here's the really dark part. Even if you overcame the fear, even if you stood your ground and fought bravely, you still probably wouldn't last long. Because medieval warfare had a dirty little secret that no one talks about. Most people didn't die from dramatic sword fights. They died from what happened after the battle was over. They died from infection, from blood loss, from being trampled by their own side, or from being executed by the enemy. The actual fighting was just the beginning of the nightmare. Now let's talk about the tactics that turned medieval battlefields into slaughterhouses. These weren't random melees. They were carefully planned massacres. First, let's talk about the hammer and anvil tactic. This was used by everyone from Alexander the Great to medieval commanders. Here's how it worked. One part of your army pins the enemy in place, while another part smashes into their flank or rear. The enemy gets crushed between them. Sounds simple, right? Well, imagine you're the guy getting crushed. You're fighting the enemy in front of you when suddenly cavalry slams into your side. You can't turn to face them because you're pressed against the men in front of you. You can't retreat because there are men behind you. You're trapped in a human vice, and the only way out is death. Then there's the false retreat. This is where an army pretends to run away, drawing the enemy into a trap. The most famous example is the Battle of Hastings in 1066. The Normans kept pretending to retreat, drawing the English off their hill, then turning around and slaughtering them. But here's what's really terrifying about this tactic. It exploits human psychology. When you see your enemy running away, your first instinct is to chase them. You want to finish them off, to claim victory. But in medieval warfare, that instinct could get you killed. The English at Hastings fell for this trick multiple times. Each time they charged down the hill, broke formation, and got cut to pieces. Discipline was everything in medieval warfare, and the moment you lost it, you were dead. Speaking of discipline, let's talk about pike squares. This was the ultimate medieval killing formation. Picture 2,000 men standing shoulder to shoulder, each holding a 20-foot pike. They move as one unit, like a giant, deadly porcupine. When cavalry charged these formations, it was like watching horses run into a wall of spears. The horses would stop, rear up, and try to back away. But the momentum of the charge would push the horses in the back into the pikes in front. It was a massacre. But pike squares had a weakness. They were vulnerable to crossbows and arrows. So smart commanders would use combined arms tactics. Crossbowmen would shoot at the pike square, forcing them to raise shields and break formation. Then cavalry would charge into the gaps. And if you were caught in one of these tactical maneuvers, you were dead. Not might be dead, not probably dead, you were dead. Medieval tactics were designed to kill as many people as possible, as quickly as possible. The really scary part is how efficient these tactics were. At the Battle of Towton in 1461, over 28,000 men died in a single day. That's more than the entire population of most medieval cities. And it happened because commanders knew exactly how to turn human beings into corpses. But even if you survived the initial charge, even if you avoided the arrows and pikes, you still had to deal with the absolute chaos of medieval combat. Because once the fighting started, all tactics went out the window, and it became a question of pure survival. Now we get to the part that movies never show you, what actual medieval combat was like. And I'm warning you now, this isn't pretty. First, forget everything you know about sword fighting. Medieval combat wasn't elegant dueling. It was brutal, desperate, and incredibly messy. Most fights lasted less than a minute before someone was dead or dying. Here's what really happened in medieval combat. You're wearing 60 pounds of armor, you're exhausted, you can barely see, and you're fighting for your life. Your sword isn't a precision instrument. It's a blunt piece of steel that you're trying to use to cave in someone's skull. Medieval swords weren't actually that sharp. They were designed to be durable, not razor sharp. You weren't trying to slice through armor. You were trying to dent it, break bones underneath it, or find gaps where you could stab. But here's the real nightmare. Medieval combat was incredibly close quarters. You weren't standing 6 feet apart having a fencing match. You were pressed body to body, grappling, punching, biting, and doing whatever it took to survive. Knights would grab their swords by the blade and use the crossguard like a hammer. They'd wrestle on the ground, trying to stick daggers through helmet visors. They'd use their armored fists like brass knuckles. It was street fighting with medieval weapons. And the noise, oh God, the noise. Steel on steel, men screaming, horses dying, the wet sound of weapons hitting flesh. Medieval chroniclers wrote about the sound of battle being so intense that men went deaf. But here's what's really terrifying. You couldn't tell who was winning. In the middle of a medieval battle, you had no idea if your side was winning or losing. You couldn't see more than a few feet in any direction. You were fighting blind, surrounded by enemies, with no idea if help was coming. And the smell. Blood has a very distinctive smell. Metallic, sweet, and sickening. Add in the smell of fear, sweat, and bodily functions, and you've got a sensory nightmare that would make you vomit. But the worst part? The ground. Medieval battlefields weren't clean, flat surfaces. They were muddy, bloody, and covered with bodies. You'd be trying to fight while stepping over dead friends, slipping in blood, and tripping over severed limbs. At Agincourt, the French knights were so weighed down by mud and bodies that they couldn't get up when they fell. English soldiers walked among them with daggers, stabbing them through their helmet visors. It wasn't combat, it was execution. And if you were wounded, well, there was no medical corps, no ambulances, no field hospitals. If you went down, you were on your own. You'd lie there, bleeding, while the battle raged around you, hoping someone from your side would find you before someone from the other side finished you off. Medieval battles were chaos incarnate. They were every nightmare you've ever had about violence, fear, and death rolled into one horrific experience. And most of the men fighting in them were just regular people like you and me, trying to survive in a world gone mad. So, let's get back to our original question. Why would you literally last 30 seconds on a medieval battlefield? We've covered the weapons, the tactics, the psychology, and the brutal reality of medieval combat. Now let's put it all together. First, you're not physically prepared. Medieval soldiers were tough. They grew up in a world without modern medicine, comfortable beds, or processed food. They were lean, hard, and used to physical hardship. You're used to air conditioning and drive-through restaurants. Second, you have no idea how to fight. And I don't mean you haven't taken a martial arts class. I mean you've never been in a real fight where someone was actually trying to kill you. You've never felt the adrenaline, the fear, the desperate need to survive. Your body would freeze up and you'd be dead before you even knew what hit you. Third, you're not mentally prepared for the horror. You've seen violence in movies and video games, but you've never seen a real person die. You've never heard the sound a man makes when a sword goes through his chest. You've never smelled blood and death and terror all mixed together. Your mind would break. Fourth, you don't understand the weapons. You might think you know how to use a sword, but medieval weapons were tools of war, not toys. They were heavy, awkward, and designed for one purpose: killing. Using them effectively required years of training and practice. Fifth, you have no idea about tactics or strategy. You wouldn't know when to advance, when to retreat, when to hold formation, or when to break and run. You'd be a liability to your own side and an easy target for the enemy. But here's the most important reason you wouldn't survive. You're not desperate enough. Medieval soldiers fought because they had to. It was fight or die, kill or be killed. You've never been in a situation where violence was the only option. You've always had alternatives, always had a way out. In medieval warfare, there was no way out. There was no calling time out, no surrendering, no going home. There was only surviving until the sun went down. And then maybe, just maybe, you'd live to see another day. The men who survived medieval battles weren't heroes. They weren't skilled warriors or noble knights. They were ordinary people who found themselves in extraordinary circumstances and somehow managed to keep breathing. They were lucky, they were desperate, and they were willing to do whatever it took to survive. You'd be dead in 30 seconds. And honestly, that might be a mercy. So there you have it. The brutal truth about medieval warfare. It wasn't glorious, it wasn't noble, and it definitely wasn't like the movies. It was industrial-scale slaughter carried out by terrified human beings with primitive weapons. The next time you watch a medieval movie or read a fantasy novel, remember what we talked about today. Remember the mud, the blood, the terror, and the chaos. Remember that real medieval warfare was far more horrific than anything Hollywood could ever show you. If you enjoyed this deep dive into medieval warfare, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. We've got tons more content about the brutal realities of medieval life that will make you grateful you live in the 21st century. And let me know in the comments, what aspect of medieval warfare surprised you the most? Are there any other medieval topics you'd like me to cover? Until next time, stay safe, stay curious, and remember, the Dark Ages were called dark for a reason.